Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Mind. Tonight, we are going to sit beneath a tree, not just any tree, a tree that has been standing at the center of one of the world's great spiritual traditions for over 2,000 years. A tree so ordinary in its shape and so extraordinary in what happened beneath it that cultures across Asia have spent centuries trying to find words adequate to the task. Most of them have given up on words entirely and simply planted another one. The Bodhi tree is not a monument. It is not a relic behind glass, or a text preserved in a sealed room, or an idea held carefully in the abstract. It is a living thing. It has roots in soil. It drops its leaves in the season when leaves are dropped. Birds nest in its canopy. Rain moves through it the way rain moves through any tree, finding its way from leaf to branch to root, returning always to the earth. And yet this particular species of fig tree, with its heart-shaped leaves and its long, elegant tips and its restless trembling in even the lightest breeze, has been considered sacred across not one, but two of the world's oldest religious traditions. It was already ancient when it became holy, and it has been becoming holier in the quiet and patient way of living things ever since. What draws people to a tree? That is worth sitting with, gently, before we begin. It is not the facts about it, though the facts are quietly astonishing. It is something closer to what the tree itself offers to anyone who sits beneath it. Shade, stillness, the soft sound of leaves that never quite stop moving, and the reminder, which requires no scripture and no translation, that something rooted this deeply does not hurry. If these gentle journeys into sleep are something you find yourself returning to, I would love for you to subscribe to The Sleepy Mind, or leave a quiet, like before you drift off tonight. It helps more tired and curious people find their way here. For now, there is nowhere to be. Let your body settle into wherever it is resting. Allow your shoulders to soften. Let your breath move at its own pace, without adjustment or effort. And let your eyes, if they are still open, grow a little heavier with each slow exhale. We are going to sit beneath a very old tree tonight, and we are going to stay there, unhurried, until sleep finds you. Let's begin. There is a tree that grows across the warmer parts of Asia, from the broad plains of northern India to the river valleys of Thailand and the forested hillsides of Sri Lanka, that most of the world would walk past without a second glance. It is a fig tree. Its scientific name is Ficus religiosa, and it belongs to the same broad family as the mulberry, the breadfruit, and the common fig that appears in Mediterranean kitchens and ancient poetry. In botanical terms, it is neither the largest, nor the rarest, nor the most structurally unusual tree in the regions where it grows. It does not flower dramatically. It does not produce fruit of any culinary distinction. It does not change color in autumn in ways that draw crowds. And yet, it has been considered one of the most sacred living things on earth for more than 2,000 years, revered across not one, but two of the world's oldest and most widely practiced spiritual traditions, tended with extraordinary care across centuries of political upheaval and cultural transformation, and planted deliberately and with great ceremony in communities from Sri Lanka to Japan to Washington, D.C. It is worth pausing there for a moment. Not a myth, not a text, not a building or a relic or an idea. A tree, a living organism rooted in soil, dependent on rain and sunlight, and the particular wasp species that alone can pollinate its flowers, something that drops its leaves and regrows them, something that can be cut down and, if enough of its root system survives, will grow back. The fact that this particular species of fig has attracted and held human reverence across such an extraordinary span of time and geography is itself a kind of fact worth turning slowly in the mind, the way one might turn a stone found on a path, feeling its weight, noticing its particular smoothness. Ficus religiosa grows quickly in warm climates. Given the right conditions, a young specimen will put on considerable height and spread within just a few years, reaching eventually up to 30 meters tall and spreading a wide and generous canopy that darkens the ground beneath it into something that feels different from the surrounding air. Cooler, stiller. The trunk of a mature tree thickens over decades into something gnarled and substantial, the bark grey-white and marked with the kind of patient texture that only time can produce. And very old specimens, those that have been growing in the same place for a century or two or more, begin to send aerial roots downward from their branches, thin grey threads at first, thickening over years into something structural, descending slowly toward the soil the way old hands reach for something steady. A mature Bodhi tree seen from a distance has the quality of a built thing rather than a grown one. Something that has been in place long enough to seem inevitable, the way a particular curve in a river seems inevitable, as though the landscape had always been arranged precisely this way. The leaves are what most people notice first and what most people remember. Heart-shaped at the base, they taper into a long, drawn-out tip that botanists call a drip tip, an evolutionary adaptation designed to channel rainfall efficiently off the leaf surface so that water does not pool and invite the growth of mold or fungus in the humid climates where the tree thrives. The shape is elegant in a way that botanical adaptations rarely are, and it has made the leaf one of the most recognizable natural forms in the entire visual vocabulary of Buddhist art and devotion. No other common fig produces quite that same elongated elegance. When the leaf falls, as all leaves eventually fall, it retains its shape. A dried Bodhi leaf, pressed between the pages of a book or kept in a small envelope or preserved carefully in a collection, remains immediately identifiable across centuries. It does not blur into generality the way many dried leaves do. It keeps its particular form. This too, though it is only botany, is not nothing, and the leaves tremble. This is the quality that observers across cultures have noted most consistently for the longest time, and it is worth staying with because it is genuinely unusual. In even the lightest movement of air, when other trees in the vicinity stand perfectly still, the entire canopy of a Ficus religiosa will shimmer and whisper and shift, every leaf moving independently, the whole tree appearing almost to breathe. The explanation is straightforward. Each leaf is attached to its stem by a long, flattened petiole, a kind of handle that is wider than it is deep, and this shape responds to the faintest lateral movement of air in the way that a wide, flat paddle responds to water. The leaves move because their stems are designed, by the same gradual process of evolutionary refinement that produced the drip tip, to respond to their environment with unusual sensitivity. They are not still in the way that other trees are still. They are alert, if a tree can be said to be alert. They register what is happening in the surrounding air, and they make it visible. People across many centuries and many traditions have interpreted this quality in their own ways. Some have found it restless. Some have found it alive in a particular way that is different from the aliveness of trees that stand more solidly in the wind. Some have found it responsive, as though the tree were paying attention to whatever was happening beneath it. And some, over the long span of human beings sitting beneath this tree and looking up into its moving canopy, have found it simply beautiful, in the way that things which do not demand anything from you in particular can be beautiful without effort or agenda. The tree also produces fruit, small figs, roughly 1 centimeter in diameter, that move through the colors of a gradual ripening from green through purple to black. They are not much to look at, and they are not particularly appetizing to human palates, but they are enormously important to the ecosystems where the tree grows. Birds return to them reliably. Bats, whose nighttime feeding patterns contribute to the dispersal of the seeds, consume them in large numbers. Insects, too numerous to catalogue, depend on various parts of the tree throughout the year. In this sense, the Bodhi tree is not only sacred in a human sense, but ecologically significant in ways that would continue regardless of whether any human being had ever noticed the tree at all. The relationship between Ficus religiosa and the small wasp, known as Blastophaga quadraticeps, is one of the more quietly astonishing facts in the natural history of the species. Like all fig trees, Ficus religiosa depends on a specific wasp for pollination, and that wasp depends entirely on the fig for its own reproduction. The female wasp enters the fig through a tiny opening, pollinates the flowers inside, lays her eggs, and dies within the fig. The next generation of wasps hatches, mates, and emerges carrying pollen to the next fig, continuing the cycle. Neither party can reproduce without the other. The tree cannot produce fertile seeds without the wasp. The wasp cannot reproduce without the tree. This relationship is ancient, extending back millions of years before any human being walked beneath these branches, and it continues today in every Bodhi tree, growing in every temple compound and monastery garden and urban roadside in South and Southeast Asia. The sacred tree and its invisible partner, bound together by something far older and far less dramatic than reverence, but no less fundamental to the tree's continuation. Ficus religiosa is also what botanists call hemiepiphytic, meaning that it frequently begins its life not in the ground, but in the crevice of another tree, or in a gap in a wall, or in the mortar of an old building, growing from a seed deposited by a bird or a bat. In these circumstances, the young plant sends roots downward toward the soil, while simultaneously growing upward toward the light. And in time, the descending roots may surround and eventually overwhelm the host structure, giving rise to the image, common in tropical Asia, of a fig tree apparently growing from a stone wall or engulfing an ancient ruin. In Cambodia, the temples of the Angkor complex are famous partly for precisely this quality, the presence of enormous fig trees whose roots have grown into and through and over the stone structures across centuries, the living and the built intertwined in ways that neither invited nor resisted, but simply produced, over time, together. It is not Ficus religiosa in every case at Angkor, but the image it evokes is consistent, that the tree, given time and the right conditions, does not stop at what is already there. It grows into and around and through. It does not demand clear ground. It begins wherever it can. In urban environments across South and Southeast Asia, Ficus religiosa trees are a common and officially protected presence, often growing beside temples and wells and public gathering spaces. Their enormous canopies providing shade that makes particular corners of cities measurably more comfortable than others. It is not unusual in an Indian city on a hot afternoon to see dozens of people gathered beneath a large peepal tree in what appears to be a completely informal way, sitting and talking and resting and conducting the ordinary business of a day, as though the tree had always been understood as a place where such things happen, which, in many cases, it has been understood as exactly that for several hundred years. This is the tree then, ordinary enough to grow beside a road, remarkable enough to have been considered sacred independently by two of the world's oldest traditions, patient enough to have survived centuries of veneration and occasional destruction and the long indifferent passage of time, and still trembling, still moving at the slightest provocation, still dropping its distinctively shaped leaves for whoever is present to receive them. It is within this tree, this trembling and rooted and generously shading fig, that one of the most significant events in the history of human thought is said to have taken place. The story begins with a man sitting down. This is not a dramatic beginning in the conventional sense. There is no approaching army, no divine intervention, no catastrophe narrowly averted. There is a man arriving at a tree, arranging a cushion of grass, and settling into a seated position from which he has decided he will not rise until something he has been pursuing for a very long time has been found. The drama, such as it is entirely interior, and that may be part of why it has lasted. His name, before he became what he became, was Siddhartha Gautama. He had been born into a noble family in the Shakya clan in what is now southern Nepal, sometime in the 5th century BCE, though the precise date remains a matter of scholarly debate and traditional accounts vary between traditions. His early life, according to accounts preserved in Pali texts, was one of considerable comfort, deliberately arranged by a father who had been told in some versions of the story that his son would either become a great king or a great spiritual teacher, and who had chosen to do whatever he could to ensure the former outcome. The young Siddhartha was kept, as much as was possible, from encountering the difficult facts of existence. He encountered them anyway: a sick man, an old man, a corpse, and finally, a wandering ascetic, whose quality of equanimity in the face of all this difficulty suggested that there was a way through it that Siddhartha had not yet found. He left the palace. He left his wife and his infant son. He left the comfortable and carefully managed life that had been constructed around him, and he went in search of what the wandering ascetic seemed to have found. For several years he practiced with great dedication under 2 teachers of meditation, reaching in each case the highest state that teacher was able to offer, and finding in each case that what he had arrived at, while genuinely rarefied, was not what he was looking for. He then turned to extreme asceticism, practicing with a group of 5 companions in conditions of severe self-deprivation, eating almost nothing, sleeping on hard ground, reducing the body to the minimum necessary for continued existence. The accounts in the Pali Canon describe him at this point as skeletal, as barely present in his body, as having pushed the physical self to a limit beyond which further pushing would simply produce death rather than understanding. And after years of this, he concluded that this path also was not the one. Not because the effort was wrong, but because the method was. Extreme deprivation, it turned out, clouded the mind as surely as extreme indulgence did. What was needed was neither excess nor deprivation, but something in between. A balanced, clear, and adequately supported awareness, the mind and body working together rather than at war with each other. He called this the middle way, and having arrived at this understanding, he accepted a bowl of rice milk from a woman named Sujata. This detail, the meal, has been preserved in the Theravada tradition for 25 centuries, with a care that suggests it was understood from early on as important. It is not a meal with any dramatic content. It is a bowl of food offered by a woman who lived near the tree, accepted by a man who had been starving himself for years. But in the context of what followed, it becomes the meal that made everything else possible. The body restored to sufficiency. The mind no longer required to manage the crisis of extreme hunger. The whole organism brought back to a condition in which it could do what it had been trying to do all along. Some small acts of nourishment contain more than their apparent size suggests. He walked to the tree. He gathered grass for a cushion. He sat down, and he made a vow that has been preserved in various formulations across different traditions, each slightly different in wording but consistent in substance. He would not rise from this seat until he had attained complete and perfect understanding. The night that followed is described in Theravada accounts in 3 broad movements, sometimes called the 3 watches of the night. In the first watch, corresponding to the early evening hours, he is said to have perceived the full span of his previous lives, not as a vague general impression, but with specific clarity, one life after another, the circumstances of each arising, and the conditions that had produced them, and the way each had led to the next, in an unbroken chain of cause and consequence. It was, in the traditional account, the experience of seeing the whole of one's existence from outside the individual moments of which it is composed. In the second watch, corresponding roughly to the middle of the night, the range of perception expanded further. He perceived not only his own previous lives, but the arising and passing of all beings across all realms of existence, seeing the way that actions and their results move through the fabric of existence the way weather moves through a valley, affecting everything it passes through, producing conditions that will determine what comes next, endlessly, without a beginning that can be identified or an end that can be foreseen. And in the third watch, in the hours before dawn, with the tree above him and the river somewhere in the darkness and the grass cushion beneath him and the Bihar night all around, he came to what the tradition calls the full understanding of the 4 noble truths: the truth of suffering, the truth of its origin, the truth of its cessation, and the truth of the path that leads to its cessation. These were not new ideas that he had discovered in the way that a mathematician discovers a new theorem. They were, in the traditional account, a direct seeing of the way things are, unmediated by assumption or preference, the mind perceiving its own nature and the nature of experience itself with a clarity that had never before been fully achieved. The understanding did not arrive by being grasped, it arrived by being allowed. The effort to reach it, which had occupied years of the most demanding practice imaginable, had done its preparatory work. And then, in the way that understanding sometimes moves, it settled into the space that the effort had cleared, the way water settles into a bowl that has been set down and allowed to become still. The tree above him had been doing, through all of this, what trees do: dropping the occasional leaf, moving in the night air, providing, with a canopy of its branches, a defined and sheltered space within the larger darkness of the night. It was not performing a sacred function in any sense that the tree could have been aware of. It was simply being what it was, which was, it turned out, exactly what was needed. The moment of the Buddha's awakening is placed by Theravada tradition at the full moon night of the month of Vesak, which falls in April or May. It is one of the most widely observed occasions in the Buddhist calendar, celebrated annually across the Theravada world, with the lighting of lamps and the offering of flowers and the gathering of communities in temple compounds. And at the center of those observances, quietly present in almost every temple compound where the gathering takes place, stands a Bodhi tree, trembling in whatever wind happens to be moving through that particular country on that particular night. Its leaves catching whatever light is available, its roots in the soil, its canopy providing what shelter it can to whoever chooses to sit beneath it. After the awakening, the texts record that the Buddha spent 7 weeks in the immediate vicinity of the tree, remaining close to the place where the understanding had arrived, moving slowly between several nearby locations. During one of those weeks, he is recorded to have stood at a distance from the tree and gazed at it without blinking for 7 full days, an act that the tradition has preserved and named. The site where he stood is marked at Bodh Gaya today as the Animisa Ketiya, the unwinking shrine. It is a small structure now, modest in scale beside the grandeur of the Maha Bodhi temple. But what it commemorates is not modest at all. It is the image of a fully awakened being, standing in the open air, directing unbroken attention toward a tree for 7 days, in an act of gratitude so sustained that it required its own name and its own marked location. Gratitude offered to a tree, not to a deity, not to a teacher, to a tree that had been present, that had provided a place, that had offered, without knowing it was offering anything, the shelter of its canopy on a night when such shelter turned out to matter completely. There is something in this image that is worth sitting with quietly, without rushing toward a conclusion. The quality of gratitude that can sustain 7 days of unblinking attention tells us something about the quality of attention that had been present beneath those branches. And it tells us something about how this tradition understands the relationship between awakening and the ordinary world in which it took place. The original tree did not last forever in its first form. Nothing does, which is in a sense one of the things the tradition that grew from beneath it has been pointing out ever since. Trees, like all living things, are subject to time and to the particular vulnerability that comes with being considered precious by those who disagree with what is precious or who regard devotion directed elsewhere as a form of competition with their own. The earliest known destruction of the Bodhi tree is attributed in traditional accounts preserved in Sri Lankan chronicles to a queen named Tisaraka, the wife of Emperor Ashoka, who is said to have ordered the tree cut down out of jealousy for the sustained and devoted attention her husband directed toward it. The account has the texture of legend more than documented history, but its broad outlines are consistent with what is known of Ashoka's passionate engagement with the site of the Buddha's awakening and of the political complexities of the Mauryan court in the 3rd century BCE. Whether the story is precisely as recorded or has accumulated details in the telling across 23 centuries, its place in the tradition reflects something real. The recognition that the things most valued are also the things most vulnerable to the resentment of those who do not share the valuing. What follows in the account is the element that the tradition has found most significant. The tree, cut down, regenerated from its roots. Ashoka, receiving this news, is described as treating the regrowth as a miracle and responding with an act of protection rather than an act of celebration. He enclosed the site with a stone railing, creating a formal boundary around the tree that marked it as a place of special care. This enclosure is the beginning of a tradition of protective attention that continues to the present day, through every subsequent railing and railing replacement and restoration project, all the way to the golden props and iron braces that currently support the ancient branches of the Sri Maha Bodhi in Anuradhapura. The regrowth itself, considered apart from any miraculous interpretation, is not botanically surprising. Many fig species have root systems of considerable resilience, and cutting the trunk of a Ficus religiosa does not necessarily kill the tree if the roots are left intact. The tree comes back because fig trees do that when conditions allow. But the tradition's response to the regrowth, the decision to mark it, to enclose it, to treat the returning of the tree as an event worth commemorating with stone, suggests something about how the relationship between the community and the tree was already being understood. The tree was not merely a landmark, it was not merely a historical site, it was something that continued, something that returned, something that the community felt responsible for and protective of in ways that went beyond ordinary property or ordinary sentiment. The second major destruction recorded in historical sources came several centuries later, in the early 7th century CE, and is considerably better documented. Shashanka, who ruled the Gauda kingdom in what is now the Bengal region of India, held strong Shaivite religious convictions and is recorded in multiple sources, including the accounts of Chinese Buddhist pilgrims, as having taken deliberate and sustained action against Buddhist sites and communities in the regions under his control. The Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya is described in these accounts as having been felled and its roots excavated, an act of destruction that went beyond simple cutting to an attempt to prevent the regrowth that had already once frustrated an earlier attempt at elimination. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who visited Bodh Gaya around the year 637 CE, recorded the aftermath of this destruction with the careful attention of a scholar who was aware he was documenting something significant. By the time of his visit, he wrote, the tree had already regrown to a height of approximately 15 meters. A king in the region, moved by the recovery, had caused the site to be enclosed and protected again. Xuanzang described the quality of reverence he observed around the recovered tree, the offerings being made, the practitioners gathered, the atmosphere of the place, with enough specificity that his account has served historians as a primary source for the condition of Bodh Gaya in that period. He was, by all accounts, a meticulous observer, and his record of a tree that had been destroyed and had come back carries the weight of someone describing something he found genuinely remarkable, even within the framework of a tradition that had, by that point, already seen the tree destroyed and recovered at least once before. The tree that grows at Bodh Gaya today is understood to be a direct descendant of the original, maintained through a lineage of cuttings and regrowths that has continued across centuries of political change and religious conflict and the long, slow passage of time. It is not the original tree in the sense of being the same physical organism that sheltered Siddhartha Gautama on the night of his awakening. The original tree is gone in its first form, as things go, but it is connected to the original tree through an unbroken chain of botanical continuity, one tree giving rise to the next, the cutting becoming the new tree eventually providing the cutting for the next, and so on across 2.5 millennia. It stands now on the western side of the Mahabodhi temple, rooted in an elevated enclosure of stone, dropping its leaves in season, trembling in the Bihar wind. The leaves it drops today fall from branches that grew from the same genetic line as the branches that provided shelter on the most significant night in the history of the tradition that now tends it. This is not nothing. It is, in fact, something that the tradition has understood with great clarity from very early on, that the physical continuity of the tree, maintained through care and cuttings and the patient willingness to begin again after destruction, is itself a form of the continuity of what the tree represents. In this sense, every act of destruction that the Bodhi tree has survived, and every act of restoration that followed each destruction, is part of its history in a way that strengthens rather than diminishes what it means. The tree that has been cut down and has grown back is not the same tree that was never cut. It is, in a quiet and important way, more itself than it was before. There is a tree growing in the ancient city of Anuradhapura, in the broad, dry plains of northern Sri Lanka, that is believed to be the oldest living tree on Earth, with a known and continuously recorded planting date. It is over 2,300 years old. This is difficult to hold in the mind as a simple piece of information. 2,300 years covers the entire span of the Common Era, and then continues back another 3 centuries before it. It covers the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the development of every major branch of Christianity and Islam, and the modern sciences, the entire recorded history of the European Americas, and the full lifespan of approximately 77 human generations. Through all of that, this tree has been growing in the same place, tended by an unbroken succession of human hands, each generation receiving the responsibility of its care from the one before and passing it to the one that followed. It is called the Sri Maha Bodhi. The name translates roughly as the Great Sacred Bodhi Tree, and the reverence embedded in that name is matched in every detail of how the tree has been maintained across its extraordinarily long life. According to the Mahavamsa, the ancient Sri Lankan chronicle compiled in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, the tree's origin in Sri Lanka began with a cutting taken from the original Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya in the 3rd century BCE. The person responsible for bringing this cutting to Sri Lanka was a Buddhist nun named Sankhamita, the daughter of Emperor Ashoka himself, who had travelled to Sri Lanka as part of a broader mission to establish Buddhism in the island kingdom. The cutting was transported not casually, but with great ceremony and care, carried in a golden vessel filled with earth taken from the site of the Buddha's awakening, as though to ensure that the new tree would carry, from its very first roots, something of the ground in which the original had grown. The entourage that accompanied Sanghamitra on this journey included monks, nuns, and representatives of the royal courts of both India and Sri Lanka, a formal delegation that reflected the understanding of what was being carried. This was not a plant being moved from one garden to another. It was the living extension of something considered among the most sacred objects in the tradition being transported across a sea to take root in new soil. The king of Sri Lanka at the time, Devanampiya Tissa, is described in the Mahavamsa as having received the cutting at the shoreline with a degree of ceremony appropriate to the arrival of something of the highest possible significance. He waded into the shallows to meet the vessel. He participated personally in the formal procession to the planting site at Anuradhapura, and he remained present as the cutting was placed in the ground, an act that the chronicle treats as one of the defining moments of Sri Lankan history, the moment at which the island's identity as a Buddhist civilization was formally and irrevocably established. The tree that grew from that cutting has been growing in the same place ever since. What this means in practice across 23 centuries is a feat of sustained institutional attention that is almost without parallel in human history. Kingdoms have risen and fallen around it. Sri Lanka has been invaded by powers from the Indian subcontinent and from Europe. The city of Anuradhapura itself, which was one of the great urban centers of ancient Asia at the height of its power, eventually fell into decline and was largely abandoned, reclaimed by the forest over centuries, rediscovered by European scholars in the 19th century, and has since been partially excavated and restored as a site of historical and religious significance. Through all of this, the tree was never abandoned. It was never left without someone to tend it. The succession of caretakers, each receiving the responsibility and passing it on, has continued without interruption from the time of Sanghamitra to the present day. The physical condition of a tree this old requires active support. The Sri Maha Bodhi's ancient branches, some of them more than 2,000 years old, have grown too heavy over the course of their immense lifespan to support their own weight. They are held up by a system of golden props and iron braces, carefully installed and periodically renewed, that allow the branches to continue growing outward without the risk of collapse. The tree is enclosed within a walled compound, its immediate surroundings maintained with the care one might give to something simultaneously extremely precious and extremely fragile. Visitors are permitted within the compound, though certain areas closer to the tree's base are accessible only to ordained practitioners and designated caretakers. The boundary between the accessible and the restricted is not enforced harshly. It is simply maintained as a matter of appropriate care, the way one maintains a respectful distance from something very old, not out of rule, but out of recognition. Offerings are made at the base of the Sri Maha Bodhi daily, as they have been made daily since the time of the tree's planting. Flowers, brought fresh each morning, are placed at the base and in the surrounding area. Lamps are lit at dawn and dusk. The ritual language of devotion has been directed toward this tree at this location, without significant interruption for longer than Christianity has existed. This is not a small fact. It is one of the longest continuous ritual practices in human history, directed toward a single specific living organism. The violence of 1985, when armed individuals attacked worshippers gathered at the Sri Maha Bodhi and killed over 150 people, was among the worst incidents of the Sri Lankan civil conflict, and among the most devastating attacks on a sacred site in the modern world. The tree itself was unharmed in the attack, its physical continuity preserved by the same combination of chance and care that has preserved it through every previous crisis across its long life. And after the attack, the offerings continued, as they had always continued. The people who had gathered there before the violence gathered there again, with grief and with determination, and the tree continued to do what it had always done, which was to stand in the same place and grow and drop its leaves and accept what was offered to it. There is something in the Sri Maha Bodhi's persistence and in the persistence of the human attention directed toward it that resists easy interpretation. It is not simply an act of faith, it is something more patient and more practical than that. It is the accumulated result of generation after generation of people making the same quiet decision to continue the tending, to receive the responsibility and discharge it faithfully and pass it on. It is what continuity actually looks like, not as an abstraction, but as a lived practice, conducted by specific human hands in a specific location over a span of time that the mind can acknowledge, but not quite fully feel. In Theravada Buddhism, the tradition practiced most widely in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, the relationship between the living community and the Bodhi tree is both formally defined and practically woven into the texture of daily religious life in ways that are sometimes so ordinary they go unremarked. The tree is formally classified as a settiya, which is the Pali term for an object or site that serves as a reminder of the Buddha and as a support for devotional practice. The settiya category is understood in Theravada, thought to encompass several distinct types of sacred object. There are relic shrines, which contain physical remains of the Buddha. There are usage shrines, which contain or mark objects that the Buddha used during his lifetime. There are commemorative shrines, which mark the significant sites and events of the Buddha's life. And there are image shrines, which contain representations of the Buddha in physical form. The Bodhi tree occupies an unusual position within this taxonomy, belonging simultaneously to the commemorative category as a marker of the site and event of the awakening, and to something adjacent to the usage category as a living organism with which the Buddha was in sustained physical contact on the most significant night of his life. It is, in this sense, a chetya of unusual density of meaning, and it is treated accordingly. In practice, this formal recognition expresses itself most visibly in the near-universal presence of a Bodhi tree in the grounds of Buddhist temples throughout the Theravada world. Walk into almost any temple compound in Sri Lanka or Thailand or Myanmar or Cambodia, and somewhere within its boundaries, usually in a prominent location near the main shrine, there will be a ficus religiosa. It may be young, a sapling of a few years, still finding its footing in the temple soil. It may be old, its trunk thick, and its canopy wide enough to shade a significant portion of the compound. but it will be there, and it will be tended with a degree of care that is proportionate to the understanding of what it represents. The tree does not need to have grown from a cutting of the Sri Maha Bodhi or the Bodh Gaya tree to hold this status. Its species is sufficient. What matters is what the species is and what it represents, not the specific botanical lineage of this particular specimen. The Bodhi tree in the temple compound is a living representative of the tree of awakening, present in the community as a daily reminder that the awakening the tradition was founded upon is not only a historical event confined to a specific location in ancient India. It is a possibility the tradition insists that can be present wherever conditions are right. The tree planted in the temple compound embodies this understanding. It is the possibility of awakening, rooted in local soil, growing in local weather, available to whoever passes through the temple gates. The offerings made at Bodhi trees in Theravada countries have developed across centuries into practices with their own particular forms and rhythms, each tradition carrying variations specific to its cultural context while sharing a common underlying intention. Flowers are placed at the base of the tree, their offering understood as an act of generosity and an acknowledgement of impermanence, because the flowers will wilt, and the act of offering them calls attention to the fact that everything offered is in the process of changing. Oil lamps are lit at dawn and dusk, small flames arranged around the base or on stands nearby, so that the tree is frequently accompanied by a circle of soft, steady light. The combination of the living tree and the circling lamps, seen in the early morning or the deepening evening, produces an atmosphere that visitors to these temples consistently describe as affecting in ways that are difficult to fully account for. In Sri Lanka, white flags and long pale banners are tied to the branches or to the railings that typically surround the temple Bodhi tree, where they move in the wind in a way that is simultaneously festive and quiet. These flags are votive offerings, tied by individuals in fulfillment of a vow or as a prayer for something needed, and the tree in a Sri Lankan temple compound may carry dozens or hundreds of them, accumulated over years of individual acts of devotion. The tree, covered in these white offerings against a sky that is very often intensely blue in the tropical light, is one of the more visually striking sights in Sri Lankan religious practice. In Myanmar, the tradition of placing small Buddha images in niches at the base of Bodhi trees means that the tree and the image exist together in a particularly direct relationship. The image sheltered by the trunk of the living tree, the tree providing a context for the image that grounds it in the specific history of where and how the person the image depicts achieved what he achieved. In Thailand, the stands of oil lamps that surround the temple Bodhi tree create, when lit, a quality of warmth and enclosure in the evening air that practitioners describe as conducive to a particular kind of settled attention. The light does not illuminate dramatically. It simply softens the surrounding dark, gently, in a way that seems to ask something calm and unhurried from whoever stands within it. The fallen leaves of the Bodhi tree deserve particular attention, because what is done with them across the Theravada world illustrates something important about how the sacred and the material are understood to relate to each other within this tradition. A fallen leaf from a Bodhi tree is not merely a leaf. It is an object that came from the tree of awakening or from a direct descendant of that tree, and its distinctive shape unmistakable to anyone familiar with it, makes it immediately identifiable wherever it is found. These leaves are collected, dried, and kept. They are used as bookmarks within sacred texts, the leaf marking the page the way a teacher's finger might mark a passage being studied. They are preserved in personal altars as devotional objects. They are given as gifts of significance. They have been found in collections and libraries across the Buddhist world, each one a small and durable reminder, carried lightly in a book or kept carefully in an envelope, of a particular tree and what happened beneath it. There is a quality of democracy in this that is not accidental. The leaf that falls from the Bodhi tree falls for anyone present to receive it. It does not fall only for the ordained practitioner or the senior teacher or the person who has traveled farthest. It falls when it falls, as leaves do, and whoever is nearby may pick it up and carry it home. The tree distributes its reminders without preference. This too, in a tradition that insists on the universality of the potential for awakening, is consistent. The Bodhi tree, as it moved north and east from its place of origin, did not remain simply what it was. It grew, as symbols do when they travel across cultures and centuries, into something that retained its original meaning, while simultaneously becoming capable of carrying meanings that the original context had not required and could not have anticipated. In Mahayana Buddhism, the tradition that developed in India from around the 1st century BCE onward and spread through Central Asia and China and eventually into Japan and Korea and Tibet, the moment of the Buddha's enlightenment beneath the tree is understood not as a unique event belonging to one historical individual in one specific lifetime, but as a revelation of a potential that exists within all of existence, in all times and all places and all beings. This shift is significant. In the Mahayana framework, the Bodhi tree is no longer simply the tree beneath which Gautama sat on a particular night. It becomes a symbol of the ground of awakening itself, the foundational reality within which all beings already exist, whether they are aware of it or not. The Avatamsaka Sutra, one of the major scriptural texts of the Mahayana tradition, and one of the longest texts in the entire Buddhist canon, addresses the Bodhi tree in terms that expand the concept far beyond any individual tree growing in any specific location. In this text, the tree is described as cosmic in scale, its roots extending into the depths of existence, its branches spanning multiple realms, its presence characterized by light and fragrance, and the company of countless Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. The jewels that adorn its branches in these descriptions are not literal jewels. They are the qualities of awakening, made visible through the visual language of visionary literature, displayed in the form of adornment on a tree that represents the totality of what awakening makes available. To sit in contemplation of this text is to encounter the Bodhi tree, not as a fig tree in Bihar, but as a kind of total environment, a reality within which awakening is not something achieved by an individual, but something that was always already the nature of the ground beneath everything. The historical tree and the cosmic tree exist simultaneously within Mahayana thought, and this simultaneity is not understood as a contradiction. The historical tree is real. It grew in a specific place. A specific person sat beneath it. Something specific and unprecedented happened there. All of that is affirmed and honored. And at the same time, What that specific event pointed toward, what it revealed, is not confined to that specific location or that specific night. The Mahayana tradition is deeply interested in the universality of what the Bodhi tree represents, in the question of what it means that a human being seated beneath an ordinary fig tree on an ordinary night could access a reality that the tradition insists is always and everywhere available. The cosmic Bodhi tree of the Avatamsaka Sutra is one answer to that question, expressed in the visual and literary language of religious vision. In China, where Buddhism arrived along the Silk Road trade routes beginning in the 1st century CE and developed over the following centuries into one of the country's 3 major religious traditions, the Bodhi tree found new forms of expression suited to a different cultural context. The Chinese name for the tree, Puti Shu, preserves the Sanskrit Bodhi in transliterated form, carrying the sound of the original word into a completely different linguistic environment. The tree is present in Chinese Buddhist temple grounds, cultivated as a symbol of awakening in the warm southern regions of the country, where its climate requirements can be met. In the cooler northern regions, other trees have sometimes served similar symbolic functions, with the intention of the planting carrying more weight than the botanical identity of the specific species. In Japan, the climate presents a genuine obstacle to the cultivation of Ficus religiosa, which requires warmth and humidity that are not reliably available through most of the country. The solution that Japanese Buddhist practice arrived at is botanically pragmatic and symbolically thoughtful. The linden tree, known in Japanese as Bodaiju, was adopted as a substitute for Ficus religiosa in Japanese Buddhist temple grounds, filling the symbolic role of the Bodhi tree in an environment where the original species could not thrive. This substitution reflects something important about how tradition adapts to circumstance. The meaning is understood to be more fundamental than the particular form through which it is expressed, and a different tree planted with the same intention and tended with the same care carries the symbol forward adequately in a climate where the original bearer of the symbol cannot survive. It is an act of practical intelligence in the service of preserved meaning, and it has worked because Japanese temple linden trees have been the site of contemplation and devotion for centuries. Their shade no less useful for the fact that their leaves are shaped differently from the leaves of a fig tree growing in the plains of Bihar. In the visual arts of Tibetan Buddhism, the Bodhi tree appears as a consistent element in the iconographic tradition of depicting Shakyamuni Buddha's enlightenment. Thangka paintings, the traditional Tibetan religious paintings produced on cotton or silk and used as supports for meditation and devotional practice, regularly depict the moment of the Buddha's awakening with the tree present in the background, its distinctive stylized leaves immediately recognizable in the visual language of the tradition. The tree in these paintings is not attempting botanical accuracy. It is performing a symbolic function, establishing the context of the depicted scene and pointing toward what the tree represents within the tradition that produced the painting. But the heart-shaped leaves and the general form of the Bodhi tree are consistent enough across centuries of Tibetan artistic production to constitute a visual shorthand that any practitioner familiar with the tradition would immediately understand. Across all of these diverse expressions, from the cosmic tree of the Avatamsaka Sutra to the linden substitute in Japanese temple grounds, to the stylized background element in Tibetan Thangka painting, the Bodhi tree maintains a consistent, essential meaning. It is the location of awakening. It is the marker of the moment when potential became actual. And it is, in the Mahayana understanding that has shaped so much of East Asian and Tibetan Buddhism, a symbol that points not only backward toward a historical event, but outward and inward toward a possibility that remains available in the present moment, wherever and whenever the conditions for it are met. Long before Siddhartha Gautama was born, long before the tradition that would eventually give the tree its most widely known name had any existence at all, the tree that botanists now call Ficus religiosa was already considered one of the most sacred living things in the world. In the Hindu tradition, which stretches back considerably further than Buddhism, and in which the tree figures as a cosmic symbol of the first order, it is known as the Ashvatha, and its significance is of an entirely different order from its role in the Buddhist narrative, rooted not in a specific historical event, but in the deep structure of Hindu cosmological thought. The Bhagavad Gita, composed in something close to its current form, somewhere between the 5th and 2nd centuries BCE, and functioning since then as one of the most widely read and studied texts in the entire Hindu canon, contains a passage in which the god Krishna, speaking to the warrior Arjuna in the moments before battle, describes the Ashvatha as the greatest among trees. The comparison he makes is direct and unambiguous. Just as the Ashvatha is preeminent among trees, so Krishna describes himself as the underlying reality present within all apparent phenomena. To recognize the Ashvatha is, in this framing, to recognize something of the nature of what Krishna describes as the highest reality. The tree is not merely a tree in this context. It is a demonstration of the divine present within the natural world, available to whoever can perceive it clearly. The relationship between Ficus religiosa and the god Vishnu in Hindu tradition is one of the most sustained associations between a deity and a specific tree in any religious culture. The Ashvatha is understood as an embodiment of Vishnu, and to circumambulate the tree, to walk around it slowly in a clockwise direction with intention and awareness, is considered an act of devotion with specific spiritual merit attached. This practice, called pradakshina in Sanskrit, is applied to many sacred objects and structures in Hindu practice, but its application to the living tree has a particular quality that devotees describe as different from circumambulating a stone image or a shrine. The tree is alive, it moves, it responds, in its trembling way, to the air around it. Walking around it in devotional awareness is walking around something that is itself, in some sense, participating. The name Ashvatha carries within it an etymology that has been interpreted in several ways by Sanskrit scholars, but one common interpretation connects it to the presence of horses, Ashva being the Sanskrit word for horse, and the tree's traditional role as a place where horses and their riders could rest in the shade during long journeys across the hot plains of the subcontinent. In this reading, the tree's sacred status and its practical utility are not separate things. It is sacred partly because it is useful, because it provides shade and shelter and a gathering place in the heat of the day. The divine and the practical inhabit the same canopy, which is not, in the Hindu tradition, an unusual arrangement. The cosmic image of the Ashvatha that appears in certain Vedic and Upanishadic texts is one of the most striking and conceptually challenging images in Hindu philosophical literature. The tree is described as growing inverted, its roots above and its branches below, a complete reversal of the visible tree's orientation. This image is not meant to describe a literal tree growing upside down. It is a philosophical image pointing toward the relationship between the source of things, which is understood as being above or prior to the visible world, and the visible world itself, which grows downward and outward from that unseen source, the way branches grow downward and outward from a root system that is hidden from view. To meditate on this image in the tradition that developed it is to practice holding in mind the relationship between what is seen and what underlies the seen, between the world of appearances and the ground of being from which appearances arise. The practical and communal dimensions of the Ashvatha's sacred status in Hindu village life are not separate from its theological significance, but are continuous with it. In many Indian villages, the peepal tree at the center of the settlement is the oldest living thing in the community and the site of its most important gatherings. Decisions have been made beneath it. Disputes have been settled in its shade. Children have been born into families that have gathered there for generations. Elders have spent their afternoons beneath it in the kind of unhurried conversation that becomes possible when a community has a designated place for unhurried conversation. The tree is considered inauspicious to cut down, believed in many communities to be inhabited by spiritual presences that deserve respect and careful handling, and this practical prohibition has the effect of preserving very old trees in locations where they might otherwise have been removed to make way for roads or buildings or the various necessities of expanding settlement. There is a quality of accumulated time in the peepal tree at the center of an Indian village that is palpable even to someone who has no awareness of its formal sacred status. The tree is simply older than everything around it. It has been there longer than the oldest person in the village, longer than the memories of the oldest people's parents and grandparents. It is the fixed point around which the mobile life of the community has organized itself for generations, and this temporal depth gives it a quality of authority and steadiness that needs no scriptural endorsement to be felt. It is simply there, in a way that very few things are simply and durably and unmovably there, and that there-ness is, for the people whose lives are organized around it, a form of the sacred that does not require a name. Before artists in the Buddhist tradition began to depict the Buddha in human form, they faced a challenge that turned out to have a quietly profound solution. The tradition's understanding of what the Buddha had become through his awakening made the project of depicting him in any ordinary sense genuinely complex. How does one represent the presence of someone who had, by the tradition's own account, moved through and beyond what presence ordinarily means into something that existing representational conventions had not been designed to capture? The answer that emerged was not an answer at all in the conventional sense. It was an absence, carefully shaped. In the earliest surviving Buddhist art, found in stone carvings and relief sculptures at Sanchi in central India, and at Amaravati in the south, and at other sites across the subcontinent, dating to roughly the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the Buddha's presence at the moment of his enlightenment is represented by two elements: an empty seat marked by a cushion or a platform, or simply a defined space, and the Bodhi tree rising behind it. No human figure, no face, no hands, no body in any recognizable form. Just the tree and the space beneath it where something of overwhelming significance had occurred. The viewer of these carvings is asked to understand, from the particular shape and character of an absence, what the tradition was insisting could not be fully captured by any image. This aniconic approach, the representation of the sacred through symbol and through the deliberate absence of a human form, was not unique to Buddhism in ancient India, but was developed with particular subtlety and consistency within early Buddhist art. The Bodhi tree in these carvings is identifiable by its distinctive leaf shape. The empty seat is identifiable by its position beneath the tree, and the devotees carved in the surrounding panels, their hands raised in gestures of offering and reverence, are clearly directing their attention toward the tree and the empty seat, establishing for the viewer exactly what these two elements together are meant to signify. The scene is complete without the central figure. The tree and the empty seat carry between them the entire weight of the event they represent. This early tradition of aniconic representation lasted for several centuries before giving way to the human depiction of the Buddha that eventually became standard across most of the Buddhist world. The reasons for the shift are debated among scholars of Buddhist art history, with various proposals offered regarding the influence of Hellenistic artistic conventions that entered northern India following Alexander's campaigns, or the changing needs of a growing devotional community for a more directly accessible visual focus. What is clear is that even after the human form became conventional, the Bodhi tree did not disappear from Buddhist visual art. It remained consistently as a background element in depictions of the scene of the awakening. The tree present behind or above the figure of the meditating Buddha, the leaves identifiable, the canopy providing its shelter over the depicted event. The tree had become, by the time human depictions of the Buddha became standard, too fundamental to the visual grammar of this scene to be removed from it. The symbolic language that developed around the Bodhi tree over centuries of Buddhist thought is layered in ways that reward slow examination. The roots, which in a mature ficus religiosa extend far beyond the visible trunk in a spreading underground network, are understood in the symbolic reading as representing the foundation of ethical conduct, the ground-level commitment to harmlessness and integrity that must be in place before the visible structure of practice can grow healthily. Without deep roots, the tree falls in the first strong wind. Without ethical grounding, the practitioner's meditation and understanding have no stable foundation on which to develop. The trunk, which in a mature Bodhi tree is solid and substantial and considerably wider than one person could easily reach around, is associated with meditation practice, the sustained and regular deepening of concentration and clarity that serves as the main structural support for everything that grows from it. Just as the trunk is what holds the tree upright and allows the branches to extend outward without collapse, meditation is what allows the qualities of wisdom and compassion to develop and spread without the practitioner losing stability. The branches and leaves, spreading outward and trembling in the wind, reaching toward light in every direction the canopy can find, are associated with wisdom and compassion as they move into the world. They are what is most visible of the tree, what provides the shade, what trembles responsively in the surrounding air, what falls to the ground and is gathered up by whoever is present. They are the part of the tree that interacts most directly with the surrounding environment, just as wisdom and compassion, in the Buddhist understanding, are the qualities that express themselves most directly in the practitioner's relationship with the world and with other beings. The leaf of the Bodhi tree, considered on its own, has become one of the most widely distributed religious symbols in the world, present in Buddhist visual culture across every tradition and every geography where Buddhist practice has taken root. Its distinctive shape, the heart at the base drawing to an elegant, elongated point, is immediately recognizable in any context where it appears. It has been carved in stone and cast in bronze and painted on walls and woven into textiles and pressed into the pages of manuscripts and printed on the covers of books and reproduced in the logos of meditation centers and retreat facilities on every inhabited continent. It is a simple form, derived from an ordinary botanical feature of a specific species of fig tree, and it has come to carry, across its 25 centuries of use as a symbolic form, an extraordinary weight of meaning. The word Bodhi, which the tree carries in its most common name, provides the final layer of the symbol's depth. From the Sanskrit and Pali root Bod, meaning to wake, to understand, to perceive clearly, the word contains within it the entire aspiration of the tradition that the tree represents. To speak the name of the tree is, in a small way, to speak of the act of waking up. To draw the shape of the leaf is, in a small way, to draw the shape of what understanding looks like when it becomes visible. And to sit beneath the living tree, wherever in the world one encounters it, in whatever temple compound or monastery garden or urban park or roadside gathering place it has taken root, is to sit within the shadow of a symbol that has been pointing, patiently and consistently, toward the same thing for longer than most of the world's cities have existed. The place called Bodh Gaya sits in the Gaya district of the Indian state of Bihar, roughly 100 kilometers south of the city of Patna, in a landscape that does not announce itself with dramatic natural scenery. There are no mountains visible from the site, no spectacular geological formations, no ancient forest pressing in from all sides. It is a town in a flat and predominantly agricultural plain, the land around it given over to rice cultivation and the ordinary business of a farming region in one of India's poorer states. The river Niranjana, called the Falgu in its lower course, runs nearby, though it is seasonal in its character and often reduced to a trickle or a series of separated pools outside the monsoon months. What draws hundreds of thousands of people to this flat and unremarkable landscape every year is a tree beside a temple, beside a stone platform that tradition holds to be the precise location where a man sat down one night, approximately 25 centuries ago, and understood something that changed the way a significant portion of humanity has thought about the nature of mind, suffering, and liberation. The site's power is not derived from its landscape. It is derived entirely from what is said to have happened there, and from the 2.5 millennia of human attention that has continued to arrive at that location as a direct result of what is said to have happened there. The designation of Bodh Gaya as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2002, under the formal name Maha Bodhi Temple Complex at Bodh Gaya, represented an international recognition of what the Buddhist community had understood for centuries: that this site belongs to human history in a way that extends beyond the boundaries of any single religious tradition or national culture. The designation brought with it both resources for preservation and the complications that attend the administration of a site that is simultaneously a major international pilgrimage destination, an active place of daily religious practice, an archaeological site of significant historical importance, and a small town in a developing region of India, with all the ordinary pressures and needs that such a town entails. The Maha Bodhi temple itself, which stands immediately beside the Bodhi tree and dominates the visual landscape of the site, is a structure of considerable age and considerable beauty. A tall pyramidal tower of carved stone, rising to approximately 52 meters, it is believed to have been constructed in its earliest form during the reign of Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, making it among the oldest continuously functioning religious structures in the world. The version of the temple visible today dates primarily to the 5th and 6th centuries CE, with significant later restoration work carried out at various points by Buddhist communities from Sri Lanka, Burma, and India. The carvings that cover its exterior surfaces represent centuries of accumulated devotional expression, layer upon layer of artistic attention directed toward the building that stands closest to the site of the awakening. The relationship between the temple and the tree is one of the more interesting spatial arrangements in any sacred site in the world. The temple does not face toward the tree from a distance, as though the tree were an object to be approached. It stands beside the tree, the two in proximity rather than in a subject-object relationship. The Bodhi tree grows on the western side of the temple, close enough that the temple wall forms one boundary of the enclosure within which the tree is contained. The effect, for someone arriving at the site, is of encountering the tree and the temple together, simultaneously, each providing a context for the other. The ancient stone and the living wood exist in a kind of company that feels, regardless of one's relationship to the tradition, genuinely unusual. The Vajrasana, the diamond throne, is the stone platform elevated directly beneath the Bodhi tree at the site believed to mark the precise spot where the Buddha sat on the night of his awakening. It is an old structure, its antiquity sufficient to make its precise dating uncertain, and it has been restored and maintained across centuries in a way that has kept it recognizable as a significant architectural element, while leaving open questions about how much of the visible structure is original and how much is the result of successive restorations. It does not matter for most of the people who come to sit near it. What matters is that this is the place. This is where it happened. And the combination of the stone platform and the tree above it and the temple beside it creates an environment in which the event that occurred here feels, to many visitors, immediately and physically present in a way that documented historical events in most other locations do not. The architectural diversity that surrounds the Maha Bodhi temple is one of the more visually striking aspects of the Bodh Gaya pilgrimage experience. Temples and monasteries built by Buddhist communities from Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Japan, South Korea, China, Bhutan, Nepal, Tibet, Taiwan, and other parts of the Buddhist world occupy the area surrounding the main complex, each structure expressing the aesthetic traditions and spatial sensibilities of its community of origin. A Thai temple, with its characteristic gilded multi-tiered roofline, stands near a Japanese structure of clean horizontal lines and restrained ornamentation. A Tibetan monastery, with its characteristic deep reds and yellows, and the smell of butter lamps, occupies a compound a short walk from a Chinese temple, where the visual vocabulary is entirely different in every detail of its decoration. The effect is of a neighborhood organized not by nationality or architectural style, but by shared direction of attention. Every building oriented in its own way toward the same thing. Through this varied and quietly busy landscape, at most hours of the day and frequently through the night, people move toward and around and beneath the Bodhi tree. The meditators gathered around the Vajrasana at dawn, their robes in the various colors of different national monastic traditions, their bodies still and their faces turned inward, have been arriving at this location, generation after generation, for as long as the site has existed as a recognizable pilgrimage destination. The sight of them, present at any hour, is one of the more moving aspects of the Bodh Gaya experience for many visitors, regardless of their own relationship to the practice of meditation. There is something in the sustained human decision to sit in stillness in this location and at this particular object's foot that communicates something across whatever distances of belief or practice might otherwise separate the sitter from the observer. Fallen leaves from the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya are gathered by pilgrims and distributed as sacred objects with a care that reflects the understanding of what they represent. They are items of significance in a way that has nothing to do with their monetary value, which is nothing, and everything to do with where they fell from. A leaf from the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, carried home in a book or an envelope by a pilgrim who has travelled thousands of kilometers to be present at this site, represents a form of connection between the traveller and the place that is at once entirely material and entirely symbolic. It is a leaf. It is also a piece of the tree beneath which the tradition's founder spent the most significant night of his life. These two things are simultaneously true, and the leaf carries both of them without any apparent difficulty. There is a quality to the presence of a ficus religiosa that people who spend time near or beneath the tree consistently describe without quite being able to fully account for. Something in the atmosphere, a quality of the air, particularly in the early morning and late evening hours, that feels different from the surrounding environment in ways that go slightly beyond what the tree's shade and its large canopy would alone explain. There are scientific observations relevant to this quality, and they are worth examining with the same care that the tradition has brought to its own observations, because they do not diminish what has been noticed, they deepen it. Ficus religiosa has been found in studies conducted by researchers in the field of plant physiology to release oxygen continuously for a significantly larger portion of the day and night than most tree species. Most trees produce oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis, the process by which they convert sunlight and carbon dioxide into the sugars that fuel their growth. Photosynthesis requires light, and when darkness falls, photosynthesis ceases, and with it the active production of oxygen. Ficus religiosa, however, exhibits a capacity for continuing gas exchange through the night through a process that researchers are still working to fully characterize. The practical result, if the observations are consistent and the conditions are right, is that the air in the immediate vicinity of a Bodhi tree at night genuinely contains more oxygen than the surrounding environment. Those who have described the quality of the pre-dawn air beneath the tree in terms that go beyond what the ordinary absence of daytime activity would produce may be responding to something physically real and measurable, even if they have described it in terms that belong to a different vocabulary than the one used in a physiology laboratory. The cooling effect of the Bodhi tree's canopy is more straightforward but no less significant in the contexts where the tree grows. In the hottest parts of South and Southeast Asia, where summer temperatures can exceed 40 degrees Celsius for extended periods, and where the difference between sun exposure and adequate shade is a difference with genuine health implications, the shade beneath a mature Ficus religiosa provides a meaningful and measurable reduction in ambient temperature. The canopy is dense enough and wide enough that the space it creates can be substantially cooler than the surrounding air, and this physical quality has made the tree a gathering place for human communities entirely independent of its sacred significance. You sit beneath it because it is cool, and the coolness is part of what has made people sit beneath it for long enough to notice that there is something else to sitting beneath it, beyond the coolness. The roots of Ficus religiosa, which in a mature tree extend far beyond the visible spread of the canopy, in a network that can span a considerable area, contribute to the local ecosystem in ways that are still being fully understood. The mycorrhizal relationships between the tree's root system and the soil fungi that assist in nutrient exchange are complex and important to the health of the surrounding soil. The fallen leaves, which decompose relatively quickly in the warm, humid environments where the tree grows most vigorously, contribute organic matter to the soil in a way that benefits surrounding plant communities. The tree is not only a recipient of ecological support from its environment, it is an active contributor to the health of the ecosystem of which it is a part. Its status as a keystone species in the ecosystems where it grows is defined by the reliability of its fruit production. Unlike many trees, which produce fruit seasonally and unpredictably, Ficus religiosa fruits in a sequence that ensures some portion of the tree is always in the process of ripening, providing a year-round food source that would not otherwise be available. For the birds, bats, and insects that depend on this resource, the presence of a Bodhi tree in a landscape is not a botanical or religious fact, but an ecological lifeline. Remove the tree, and the effects ripple outward through the food web in ways that extend far beyond the tree itself. Populations of fruit-eating birds may decline. Insect communities that depend on the tree for habitat may be disrupted. The cascading effects of the tree's removal would, in a functioning ecosystem, be detectable at considerable distance from the tree itself. The aerial roots that descend from the branches of very old Ficus religiosa specimens, thickening over decades from thin threads into substantial structural supports, create one of the most visually distinctive features of mature trees of this species. In specimens that have been growing for a century or more, these roots can form a curtain around the main trunk, creating enclosed spaces within the root system that provide habitat for small animals and a sheltered interior that is accessible to human visitors only by moving through the living root structure. The overall effect, in a very old tree, is of something that has transcended the category of tree and become more like a small forest unto itself, a complete environment produced by the long accumulation of the same organism's continuous growth. The quivering of the leaves, which has been the most consistently observed and most variously interpreted quality of Ficus religiosa across all the cultures that have encountered it, has the simplest possible botanical explanation, and there is nothing in the simplicity of that explanation that diminishes the validity of what has been noticed. The leaves move because their stems are designed to respond to air movement with unusual sensitivity. This is a fact about how the tree is built, and the fact about how the tree is built produces a visible quality in the tree that is unlike the quality of trees built differently, a responsiveness, a continuous registration of what is happening in the surrounding environment, a trembling in response to the faintest available wind. The tree is doing what the tree does, and what the tree does, when observed by human beings, who are themselves doing what human beings do when they sit quietly and pay attention, is to appear to be paying attention. The sensitivity is real. The responsiveness is real. The interpretation of what that sensitivity means belongs to the observer, and across 25 centuries of observers, the interpretations have been varied and often beautiful and sometimes contradictory and consistently impossible to summarize. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Ficus religiosa is, by any measure, an unusual tree. Its longevity, its oxygen production, its ecological centrality, its distinctive leaf morphology, its aerial roots, its trembling responsiveness, its fruit production cycle, and its capacity for regrowth after even substantial damage combine to produce a tree that would be remarkable in any context. The fact that a man happened to sit beneath one on a particular night 25 centuries ago, and that what happened during that night became the founding event of one of the world's major religions, does not change what the tree is. It is still a tree, still doing what trees do, still dependent on rain and light and the small wasp that pollinates its flowers. But the convergence of the tree's own unusual qualities and the event that took place beneath it produced something that neither the tree's botany nor the event's significance could have produced alone. A symbol that is simultaneously alive, which most symbols are not, and ancient and continuing, and available to be sat beneath by anyone who finds their way to where one grows. The history of human attention directed toward the Bodhi tree is long enough and contains enough variety to function almost as a history of the Buddhist tradition itself, seen from an unusual angle. It includes acts of devotion so sustained as to be almost unimaginable, acts of destruction so thorough as to seem definitive, acts of scholarship so careful that the records they produced remain useful 23 centuries later, and acts of quiet individual attention so numerous and so ordinary that they have left almost no trace in the historical record at all, which is perhaps the most significant category of all. Emperor Ashoka, who ruled the Mauryan Empire from approximately 268 to 232 BCE, across a territory that stretched from what is now Afghanistan in the west to Bangladesh in the east, occupies the first clearly documented position in the history of formal human attention to the Bodhi tree. His conversion to Buddhism following the devastating military campaign against Kalinga, in which massive casualties on both sides are said to have produced in Ashoka a revulsion toward violence so profound that it changed the entire orientation of his reign, is one of the more dramatic documented conversion narratives in ancient history. His subsequent devotion to the site of the Buddha's awakening at Bodh Gaya expressed itself in stone and in administrative action. The construction of protective enclosures around the tree, the formal designation of the site as a pilgrimage destination, the recording of his own visits in edicts that have survived in inscribed form to the present day. The personal quality of Ashoka's relationship with the Bodhi tree, as it emerges from the historical record, is worth noting. His edicts, which are formal administrative documents inscribed in rock and pillar across his vast empire, are not typically characterized by personal warmth or individual feeling, but his references to the site of the Buddha's awakening carry a quality different from the bureaucratic language that surrounds them, a quality that subsequent scholars have read as reflecting something genuinely personal in his engagement with the place. He visited it himself. He went in person to the location, and whatever he found there stayed with him in a way that expressed itself in sustained administrative attention to the site's preservation for the rest of his reign. The Chinese pilgrim Faxian, who travelled from China to India in the early 5th century CE, undertaking a journey of extraordinary difficulty by land and sea that lasted approximately 15 years in total, arrived at Bodh Gaya around the year 405 CE with the quality of attention of someone who had been moving toward this place for a very long time. His account of the site, preserved in a travel record that remains one of the primary historical sources for conditions in India and Central Asia at that period, describes the Bodhi tree and the structures surrounding it with the careful specificity of a scholar who was aware he was documenting something of lasting importance. He noted the quality of the gathering around the tree, the offerings being made, the presence of practitioners from multiple traditions and nationalities, and the overall atmosphere of the place, which he clearly found remarkable even by the standards of a traveller who had already seen a great deal. Xuanzang, whose visit to Bodh Gaya approximately 2 centuries after Faxian's provides the most detailed account of the site from the 1st millennium CE, was a scholar of formidable capacity who had undertaken his journey to India partly out of dissatisfaction with the quality of the Buddhist texts available in Chinese translation and a determination to obtain better Sanskrit originals at their source. His record of conditions at Bodh Gaya around 637 CE includes the description of the tree's regrowth after Shashanka's destruction, the quality of the surrounding community, the architecture of the Mahabodhi temple as it stood at that time, and the practices of the practitioners gathered at the site. His account is characterized throughout by the combination of detailed observation and careful judgment that marks the best scholarship of any period, and his obvious personal engagement with what he was witnessing gives the record a warmth that purely factual reporting would not have produced. The Tibetan scholar and monk Atisha, who visited Bodh Gaya in the 11th century CE during a period of considerable instability in the Buddhist world, and who would go on to become one of the most important figures in the transmission of Buddhism from India to Tibet, described the experience of meditating at the Vajrasana in terms that convey the particular quality that this location has consistently been reported to hold for practitioners who bring sustained attention to it. The site affected him in ways he considered significant to his practice and his understanding, and the memory of having been there was something he carried with him into his later work in Tibet, where the tradition he helped to establish has continued to look toward Bodh Gaya as the center of a living geography of sacred significance. The 19th century brought the Bodhi Tree and Bodh Gaya to the attention of a broader world through a combination of British archaeological investigation, Sri Lankan Buddhist reformist energy, and the particular power of popular literature to carry unfamiliar subjects into unexpected hands. Sir Edwin Arnold, a British poet whose 1879 work about the life of the Buddha, written in verse and aimed at a general readership, reached an audience far beyond what any scholarly treatise on the same subject could have reached, described the night of the awakening beneath the Bodhi tree with genuine lyrical skill and with a quality of sympathy for his subject that communicated itself to readers who had previously known nothing about the tradition he was writing about. His book introduced the Bodhi tree to people across Britain, the United States, and the English-speaking world, who had no framework for understanding what it represented within its own tradition, but who responded to the power of the story it was central to, with something that, in many cases, led them toward a deeper engagement with that tradition. Anagarika Dharmapala, the Sri Lankan reformer whose work to restore Bodh Gaya to Buddhist management extended from the 1890s into the early 20th century, brought to this cause the energy of someone who understood the site's significance from within the tradition that had produced it, and who was not prepared to accept its continuing administration under circumstances that excluded Buddhist participation. His advocacy was sustained, passionate, occasionally contentious, and ultimately effective in ways that contributed to the site's current status as a place of active Buddhist practice and international pilgrimage. He visited Bodh Gaya for the first time in 1891 and described the experience as transformative in ways that determined the direction of much of his subsequent life's work. He found the site in a condition of relative neglect, its Buddhist character diminished by circumstances that had accumulated over centuries of interrupted care, and he left with a determination to restore it that occupied him for the rest of his life. Through all of these centuries of named and recorded attention, and through the far greater number of centuries of unnamed and unrecorded attention, the tree continued to grow. The pilgrims came in their various forms and from their various starting points, and sat beneath it, or walked around it, or left offerings at its base, or simply stood and looked up into its trembling canopy, and then turned and went back to wherever they had come from. And the tree, as trees do, paid attention to none of it in any way that can be documented, and continued to be exactly what it had always been. A cut-in from a tree is one of the smallest things that can contain a lineage. It is a section of branch, a node or two, the possibility of roots that have not yet formed. It weighs almost nothing. It can be wrapped in damp cloth and carried in a bag or placed in a vessel of water for a journey by land or sea. It requires, for its survival during transport, only moisture and reasonable temperature, and someone willing to attend to it carefully. and if the conditions at its destination are adequate, and the planting is done with care, it becomes a tree. The same tree, in every genetic detail that matters, as the tree from which it was taken, a continuation rather than a copy. The practice of propagating the Bodhi tree through cuttings is understood within Buddhist tradition not as a form of horticulture in the ordinary sense, but as the preservation and extension of a living spiritual lineage. The word lineage in Buddhist contexts carries significant weight. It refers to the unbroken transmission of understanding and practice from teacher to student across generations, the chain of direct human connection that links practitioners in the present to the tradition's origins in the past. To speak of the Bodhi tree as a lineage is to extend this concept from persons to plants, to suggest that the living organism carries something of what it descended from in a way that is not merely metaphorical, but genuinely botanical, and that tending this lineage is a practice continuous with the other forms of preservation and transmission that the tradition considers fundamental. The lineage begins in the form that can be traced at Bodh Gaya with the original tree and its first recorded cutting. The cutting brought by Sanghamitta to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE, transported in its golden vessel of sacred earth, was the founding act of a botanical lineage that has now extended across more than 2,000 years and multiple continents. The Sri Maha Bodhi at Anuradhapura, grown from that cutting, became in its turn the primary source of authenticated cuttings for Buddhist communities across the world. A living root system from which the lineage has continued to branch outward with each generation that has requested and received a piece of it. The geographic range of the living Bodhi tree lineage, as it exists today in the form of trees grown from documented cuttings of the Sri Maha Bodhi and its descendants, is remarkable. Japan, where the climate does not favor ficus religiosa, but where the devotion to the symbol it represents has found botanical expression through various means, including cuttings maintained in specially prepared environments. Australia, where Buddhist communities established by Asian immigrant populations over the past century have included the planting of authenticated Bodhi trees as part of the establishment of temple and monastery grounds. The United Kingdom, where a cutting from the Sri Maha Bodhi was received and planted in a context that connected the tree's ancient Sri Lankan lineage to a relatively new Buddhist presence in Northern Europe. The United States, where a cutting was formally presented and planted in Washington, D.C., bringing the living lineage of a tree whose roots trace back to a fig tree in ancient Bihar into the soil of the American capital. Each of these plantings was an act of intention. Someone requested the cutting. Someone prepared it for transport. Someone received it at its destination and planted it with care. Someone has tended it since. The human attention that surrounds each of these trees, from the moment of its planting to the present day, is a continuation of the same quality of attention that has surrounded the Sri Maha Bodhi at Anuradhapura for over 2,300 years, expressed in a different location and perhaps in a different language, but oriented in the same direction and carrying the same understanding of what is being preserved. What is being preserved is not easy to state simply, which may be part of why the living tree has served the tradition better than any text or image could in this particular role. A text can be translated, and in translation something shifts. An image can be reproduced, And in reproduction, something is always slightly different from the original. But a tree grown from a cutting of another tree is, in every biological sense that matters, the same tree continued. The DNA is identical. The leaf shape is identical. The trembling quality of the canopy in a light wind is identical. The capacity for the same extraordinary longevity, given the same conditions of care, is identical. What is carried forward in the cutting is not a memory or a representation, but an actual continuation of the living organism. This continuity points towards something that the tradition has been insisting on since the night of the awakening itself, that what the Bodhi tree represents is not confined to a single moment or a single location. The potential for awakening that was demonstrated beneath the tree in Bihar on a particular night in the 5th century BCE is, in the tradition's understanding, a potential that exists in all times and all places and all beings, requiring only the right conditions to become actual. The tree, by its very nature, as a living and reproducible organism, capable of taking root in new soil and growing under new skies and dropping its distinctively shaped leaves for whoever is present to receive them, embodies this understanding more fully than any other kind of sacred object could. A stone relic remains where it is. A manuscript stays in its library. A shrine marks a single location. But a tree grows from a cutting, and the cutting grows into a tree, and the tree drops cuttings that can be carried to wherever the tradition finds itself growing next. And each new tree is in every meaningful sense the same tree as the tree that sheltered the man who sat down on a cushion of grass beside a river in northern India and made a vow that changed the way a significant portion of humanity has thought about the nature of mind ever since. There is something in this that is worth sitting with, quietly, as the eyes grow heavy and the breath settles into its own slow rhythm. The Bodhi tree does not require you to understand it. It does not require your reverence or your knowledge or your agreement with the tradition that has grown around it. It requires, from any organism that sits beneath it, only what it has always required from every organism that has found its way into its shade. The willingness to be present in that particular spot, beneath those particular trembling leaves, in whatever quality of attention is currently available. That has always been enough. The tree has provided its shade to practitioners and pilgrims and wanderers, and the simply curious for 25 centuries without apparent preference. It has sheltered the devout and the skeptical, and the exhausted, and the seeking, and the simply overheated alike, giving each the same canopy, and the same cool air, and the same quality of filtered light. It continues to do so now. Somewhere, at this moment, on the western side of the Maha Bodhi temple in Bodh Gaya, the Bodhi tree is doing what it has always done. Its leaves are trembling in whatever air is moving through that plain tonight. Its roots are in the same soil that has held them for generations. Its canopy is providing shelter to whoever is present beneath it, whether they are sitting in formal meditation or have simply arrived at the tree's base and stopped. And somewhere else, in a temple compound in Sri Lanka, or Thailand, or Myanmar, or Japan, or Australia, or the United Kingdom, or Washington, D.C., a tree grown from the lineage of that tree is doing exactly the same thing, trembling, rooted, providing shade, dropping the occasional leaf for whoever is present to receive it, continuing. As we come gently to the end of our time beneath the Bodhi tree, let the whole of it settle for a moment before it fades. We began with a fig tree, ordinary enough in its species and its habits to grow beside a road in a warm country without attracting a second glance. And then we stayed with it long enough to find that it was not ordinary at all, or rather, that its ordinariness was precisely the point, that the most significant thing that happened beneath it happened not in spite of its being an ordinary tree, but because of it, because it was rooted in soil, because it trembled in the wind, because it provided shade to a man who needed shade, on a night when shade turned out to be the only thing standing between him and the open sky. We travelled the tree's long history, from the banks of the Niranjana River in ancient Bihar to the plains of Anuradhapura, where a cutting placed in golden earth more than 2,300 years ago is still growing, still tended by hands that received the task from other hands, in an unbroken chain of care that reaches back further than most of the world's living institutions. We sat beside the stone platform of the Vajrasana and looked up into a canopy that has been trembling above that particular spot through the rise and fall of empires, through destruction and regrowth, through centuries of pilgrims arriving from every direction with their bowls and their robes and their long accumulated questions. We walked through the traditions that have gathered around this tree across the millennia. The Theravada devotion that plants a Bodhi tree in every temple compound as a living reminder that the possibility the tree represents has not been confined to a single night in history, but continues to be available wherever the roots can find good soil. The Mahayana understanding that expands the tree into something cosmic, a symbol not of one awakening, but of the ground of awakening itself, present in all times and all places and all beings who have not yet noticed that it is there. The Hindu tradition that recognized the Ashvatha long before Buddhism gave it its most widely known name, that understood it as a demonstration of the sacred made visible in the form of leaves and roots, and the particular quality of shade that a very old, very rooted thing provides. We watched the leaves fall and learned what is done with them. We sat with the ecological reality of a keystone species whose quiet contributions to the life around it extend far beyond what is visible from beneath its canopy. We followed the lineage of cuttings across oceans and centuries, from a golden vessel carried by a Buddhist nun across a stretch of sea to a stone planting ground in an ancient city, and from there outward into the soil of countries whose existence the original tree could not have anticipated. And underneath all of it, running quietly through every cluster and every century and every carefully tended cutting, was one quality that the tree itself embodies without effort or intention, the quality of continuing, of being present in the same place, in the same way, through whatever circumstances accumulate around it, of dropping its leaves in season and growing them back, of trembling in the wind without being uprooted by it, of providing to whoever arrives beneath it, in whatever condition they arrive, the same generous and entirely unprejudiced shade. There is something the tree offers that requires nothing from you in return. No belief, no understanding, no prior knowledge of the tradition that has grown up around it. Only the willingness to stop moving for long enough to receive what shade is being offered. And there is something in that offer, patient and consistent, and extending across 25 centuries of human arrivals and departures, that the mind can rest inside without needing to fully comprehend it. If these gentle journeys into slow and curious nights have become something you find yourself returning to, you are warmly welcome at the Sleepy Mind, and a quiet like or a subscription left before sleep arrives helps more tired and wandering people find their way here. This channel exists because of the people who return to it, one soft evening at a time, and their presence here is felt and appreciated. And if another journey would serve you better than sleep tonight, there is one waiting on the screen, another slow door into a quiet world, ready whenever you are. But if your eyes are growing heavier now, as the tree and its long history begin to soften at their edges and lose their detail in the way that things soften just before sleep, let them close. Let the Bodhi tree fade the way the light fades at the end of a warm afternoon. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, the canopy becoming less distinct, the trembling of the leaves becoming something you can feel more than see, and then something you can remember more than feel, and then simply a quality in the air around you, a coolness, a stillness, the particular texture of having spent time beneath something very old and very rooted and very patient. Let your shoulders release whatever they have been holding since this morning. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands rest exactly where they are, without needing to hold or reach for anything. The day is done. Whatever it contained, it has finished now. The last leaf of the evening has fallen. The bell has sounded for the final time tonight, and the great silence has arrived. The silence that the tree has always known. The silence that was present beneath its canopy before the first pilgrim arrived, and will be present long after the last one has gone. You do not need to carry any of what you heard tonight into tomorrow. The mind will keep what it needs. It always does. The rest can be released, the way a tree releases its leaves in the season when leaves are ready to be released, without effort, without resistance, without any sense that releasing them is a loss. All that remains now is the breath, slow and even and entirely your own, moving in the same rhythm it has always moved, the same rhythm that carried you through everything the day contained, asking nothing in return except that you allow it to continue. Let it continue now. The tree is still. The leaves have quieted. The long night has arrived, and it is gentle, and it is yours. Sleep well, and good night.